So, to start working on our characters, we need to start by understanding their overall proportions. When we're kind of thinking about art, and I think I've used this diagram before, this is from CG artist Neil Blevins, we're thinking about it in terms of reads. What's the first, second, third, fourth thing we see? Usually that first thing we see is an overall blocky, maybe even silhouette shape. Usually we see something in terms of its proximity to us, and then when we're breaking into the shape itself, we're thinking about extremities. This is why if you're dealing with like a wild animal, like a bear, they say try to make yourself look as large as possible, or stand together really closely in a group of people. It makes you harder to make you indistinguishable by yourself, and it often intimidates other creatures because they just see it as one giant person. This first read is something that we're very good at breaking down into second and third reads. The closer you look at a person, the more detail you see. Usually the first things you take away from a person when you initially see them is their overall proportions. Height to width, all of that kind of stuff. And then we start to notice those secondary features and forms as we look on them more closely. This means when we're creating art, we kind of take the same approach. We use the term proportion. This actually comes back from our good buddy Roman architect Vitruvius, who actually laid out, because of his study of classical orders in architecture, which at the time was all about proportions. Pillar is this tall, the base is this wide, it's made out of this kind of stone, it won't fall down. He thought, realizing that he could apply some of those same rules to study the human form, and it was actually Leonardo da Vinci who took his writing and converted it into the Vitruvian Man based on classical principles, basically reconstructing a person, not from sketching from life, but drawing from the series of rules or proportions that Vitruvius had discovered. And there actually are a lot of, although, humans vary, across each other quite a bit, we all have slight differences. Proportionately, we're pretty close to the same. That's why, as we get taller and shorter and everything, there's certain rules our bodies seem to follow. And one of the most important questions when you're doing any kind of character is, how many heads tall is it? And so this is a diagram from a really talented anatomist from the turn of the century called Andrew Loomis. And one of his models was to really take this head idea through, where he was looking at, in a normal sort of academic proportions used at a lot of art schools, they had this 7.5 head model. Whereas they see in fashion, you might have an 8 or 8.5 head, whereas sculpture, we would say superheroes are like this, are often what we call 9 heads tall. And these proportions in a standard Loomis 8-head body go something like this. You have your head, and then down 1 head below that is the nipple line. 1 head below that is right where both our elbows should line up, as well as our belly button. 1 head below that, right in the middle, is about the groin. So the point right there is like the base of the groin. Head below that is really somewhere in the apex of the leg tapering in, but 1 head below that is at the bottom of the knee. A head below that is just below the calves, and then we have the feet on the ground. And then other things could be measured from there out within it. For instance, understanding that if I take this head and I rotate it, it's about 2 1/3 or 2 heads stacked wide as well. So these were just different rules that could be created to help better understand and break things down. But if you want to go, say, with the more heroic proportions, you just understand where your proportions are here and how things are slightly different. So this way, you can start with your base and always make sure you're consistent about how big things are supposed to be, because you're using the head, which is something that's often a really defining characteristic of a person, as our standard of measurement. Now, as we get older, that's what's interesting about it, is our heads don't change shape and size that much. So here we have a diagram demonstrating from a 1-year-old at about 4 heads tall, and we see how dramatically the body proportions change, but the head sizes don't really change that much. If you ever really held an infant or seen a toddler, they have enormous heads proportional to their bodies. This is also, though, what helps us understand where someone's an adolescent or an infant or an adult, is the relative number of heads tall they are, because our torso tends to lengthen out. Even as right about 15 years old, your head is about as big as it's gonna be. This is also something on how we create cute characters. So thinking about our chart here, we can think about these video game characters as proportions of heads, where Kirby is literally just a head, so Kirby's 1 head tall, but an Animal Crossing character is 2 heads tall, where they pretty much have their bodies the same size as their head. Mario is a little bit more active. Sonic is in the same realm, where he's a head and sort of like 2.5 heads tall overall. Splatoon gets a little bit more stylish with their characters. They're more like a 3.5 head, and pretty standard for the Legend of Zelda scenes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5, sometimes 6. Usually in the more mature looking Zelda games. In the Toon Zelda games, they're more in this realm. But in the more sort of like stylistic, like Breath of the Wild, Twilight Princess kind of things, Link tends to be 5.5 to 6 heads tall, which is also very common in anime. Then we start getting into more realistic characters. This is where we start to see that 7.5 to even this 8 head tall, very heroic looking Kratos. And then sometimes you get more in exaggerated forms. So like Samus is armored and very exaggerated, and Samus, I think, is a whopping 9 heads tall here. And so understanding these proportions and where things generally line up is really important, because there is a visual difference between Kratos and Kirby, and a lot of it has to do with their sense of proportion to each other. And the head is maybe one of the most important factors there. So why should you spend a lot of time studying this anatomy? So here's an example of some Disney animators who are going to be doing stylized, exaggerated work, doing life drawing, and lots of it. In fact, here's a Glenn Keane illustration from some of his work on Tarzan, demonstrating how much he was thinking about the anatomy and musculature underneath it. So, like, you might ask yourself, like, looking at this painting here, obviously something like a Renaissance painting you might be thinking, or turn of the century, and you'd ask who's the artist, and most people wouldn't guess this is actually an early work by Pablo Picasso, better known for his extreme abstract painting. In fact, Pablo Picasso was cited in his early days by his art teachers as being one of the best and most talented, very realistic painters out there. He had mastered the style, and he decided to exaggerate it to create something new, and he created an entirely new art movement. Because in order for us to exaggerate and stylize, we have to have a good foundation of what the actual rules are so we know how to break them. If you don't learn the true core anatomy of like what realistic anatomy looks like, then you're just copying someone else's style. Developing your own style requires doing the real and then figuring out what you do and don't want to exaggerate. And then you can develop your own style. Otherwise, you're just mixing and matching other people's styles and hard work. In fact, a lot of people are big fans of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and the artist who is behind the whole series, Hirohiko Araki, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that last name wrong, I'm so sorry, is obsessed, even though he's well known for exaggerating characters and features, he is obsessed with anatomical study, specifically Renaissance studies. Said as he spends most of his time doing deep, very realistic study of anatomies so that he can exaggerate them and make them more interesting. In fact, a lot of his work is rife with references to classical statues from the Renaissance era. So like every good stylized person you might know of, no matter how wild or out there they are, they probably started very, very realistically. As a matter of fact, the father of manga, who did, name escapes me at the moment, but created basically the style we know as manga, was himself a physician and a doctor who spent his time drawing incredibly detailed anatomical studies as part of his medical degree, which is how he got into drawing. So how do you study this stuff? Obviously, this class isn't an anatomical class. I'm going to try to touch on this week a couple things to get you started. I'm going to give you some resources, but here are some good things to check out. One of the best things you can do is human figure drawing. Even if it's awkward, like it's not going to be good when you first start, but you just sketch it out. I really like, there's a YouTube channel called New Masters Academy that does a lot of timed drawings where you just put it on YouTube, you get your paper out, and you just sketch along with the timing, because it's trying to force you to do it quickly helps you break down those shapes quickly and stop thinking so much about details and more about big form and proportion. There's some great books out there. Probably the most common book used by character illustrators today is Anatomy for Sculptors. I got a copy sitting on my shelf back there. It's really great. The way I learned anatomy was from Andrew Loomis books. They're really great. They're also in like the public domain. You should check out Andrew Loomis's books are all on saveloomis.com as PDFs for free, and especially Figure Drawing for All It's Worth and Drawing the Head and Hands are two really incredible resources that just dive deep into helping you understand how things should line up. And then George Bridgman is one of my favorites as well. And Bridgman's work is incredibly influential in the series Doom. In fact, the character artist say specifically the creature design in the updated Doom series is based off of George Bridgman's approach to anatomy. There are also classes, of course, around here you can take. One of them taught by Ricardo Guimaraes that is usually run in the summer. MI 491, Anatomy for Artists, where you just dive deeply into anatomy. Anatomy takes a long time to learn, and it takes a lot of deep study, and it's one of the reasons characters are tough. But I'm hopefully going to be able to show you some tricks that we can speed things up for us. So before I jump out here, I wanted to look through and just point out a couple other major features that you might want to consider as part of the anatomy study. Not only the head and the number of heads tall, but a couple really key things I want you to look out for when you're laying out your characters. One of the most important being the spine is not straight. It has a curve to it, and in fact, it pokes in here and then it pushes out there. This curvature of the body is really important to make him look like a real person. One of the biggest mistakes I say that phrase a lot, I know, but when people are first creating characters, is really straight. And they're all perfectly lined up, and it makes something really, really boring looking. Not only that, the legs don't shoot straight down, and nor do they open up from, back in here. The legs, actually, the bones come out, and then the legs come down. In fact, when you're standing straight, your legs are usually tilted in just a little bit. Especially in women, this is more pronounced because they have slightly wider hips than in male anatomy. So they tend to have their legs in a natural position, tend to be angled in a little bit at a natural resting or standing position. Also be considering that there's a lot of space between the head and the neck. Again, something people don't get enough space for, but what's really important is it's not flat here. In fact, this area is at a pretty steep angle that the neck protrudes from, and it doesn't go straight up. It leans forward. It's more natural for us. I know we're all slouchers, but that's also what happens. The elbow and the knee are both halfway between their respective arm and legs. So you can see there's the top, there's the bottom. Right in the halfway mark is that elbow. And the fingers, when the hand is all the way to the side, are really right about here, and we can consider that just above halfway up the leg, because the leg actually starts up here, not down here. There's a bunch of muscle and mass and tissue up here. This is one of the key bony landmarks. It's called the iliac crest. If you press on your hip or on your side, you'll feel that bone right there. Usually it's right where your waistband on your pants are. And this is what that is. And it doesn't matter how much weight you have, you're gonna have an iliac crest because there's nothing there. Another really crucial landmark is this here, the sternum and the clavicle, where you can feel up on top this little bony protrusion here and here. These are really important to the rigging of the arm and the chest area. Of course, there's a lot of other things that we're going to talk about with this, but I wanted to give you a couple of these key things. And remember, when we're doing human characters, a lot of human characters are a lot, and when it comes to your body, is a lot of legs. Of course, if you're doing like a chibi or stylized or exaggerated character, they might have bigger heads than their bodies. But when it comes to the body, legs are usually about half of it. Like as you can see here, that's one of the things that makes us human. We like our legs. So with that, I'm going to show you in the next video how we can take some of our reference from last week and actually block in a character. I'm going to give you sort of a step-by-step recipe for getting a solid base mesh for you to work on in this project.